we speak, food inflation has hit over 20%. Fearless and authentic voices.
I think what we should do is coming out to demand of the president to do his job. Every other thing is trying to.
So good morning, Dr. Tobin. Thank you for joining us on the Avalon Radio this morning. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So you have done an incredible work on the hijab or the scarves that Muslim women wear across the world, and I find your work really educating and very insightful. But let me start by asking you. You talk about the Arabian historian in your book, Albert Horani, who predicted in 1950, that the hijab would disappear by the 20th century, and this was based on his personal observation of the development happening in Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. Including Syria. But that has not happened. Instead, what we have seen is that the numbers of those using hijab has essentially doubled since then. What explains this phenomenal rise in the use of these headscarves by Muslim women across the world?
That's an excellent question. So many analysts and academics, researchers believed for quite a while that the world was going to become more secular, was going to become less religious. And the secularization theory was this theory to which Horani was speaking and others have spoken. And really, they were just proven wrong. Academics get it wrong. Researchers can get it wrong. And this is certainly a case where that happened. Now, in my work, I have focused on the Levant, as you mentioned, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine as well. And, I started my research in Jordan, and a lot of women who are now approximately in their 60s, 70s, sometimes in their late 50s, they would say things like, when I was growing up, I would wear mini skirts and I would wear tank tops and I would wear these, small clothes. And that's because we didn't understand what Islam was. But once we understood what Islam was, we understood we needed to act differently. And acting differently meant acting in accordance with what they believed to be the real Islam. And the real Islam meant dressing modestly, and to dress modestly meant the headscarf. So this kind of rise of what researchers have called Islamization really occurred as part of several kind of larger global political events in the 1970s, especially, where, for example, you have the Iranian Revolution occurring, you have the 67 war in Palestine and Israel. You have global events that are occurring in ways that really promote Islam as a kind of singular text-based religion. And part of adhering to that as believers requires adhering to the sort of prescriptions for modesty and dress. And so really what we see, what explains this rise in wearing the hijab is really about how understandings of Islam have come to be more singular and more text-based and more about adherence to the law. So if you ask Muslims who are older, who are in their 60s or 70s or even older than that, as well as scholars, for example, in Egypt, feminist scholars in particular, Islam is no longer the kind of ethical understanding that they grew up with. Leila Ahmed is a notable Muslim scholar of Egypt who's written about sort of what she grew up with as a women's Islam, which was quite ethical and morally guided through oral histories, and how that coexisted and then later became supplanted by what she understood as a men's Islam, which is this text-based idea. And so, I don't think that it reflects anything more than the way that Islam has changed over time and has developed over time throughout the world.
We'll talk about the political slant towards all of this, but I'm also concerned about the fact that, for instance, in Nigeria, we've had very serious debates about wearing of headscarves in public schools or in public institutions, if you'd like. The case has gone up until the Court of Appeal, which is the second highest court of the land. And it has consistently affirmed the rights of women to wear these headscarves in public places. I guess my question is, what is it about the headscarf that evokes this negative emotion, particularly around secular public institutions across the world, that makes it difficult for them to accept a Muslim girl wearing a scarf?
It's a vexing question, isn't it? It's one that really does, I think, perplex and muddle and frustrate people. And, ultimately, the conclusion that I and many others have come to is that when the fear of a lack of control in society starts to occur, when people are nervous about the direction that society is going, when they worry about things like either too much progressivism or too much conservatism, the locus of that fear becomes women and their bodies. And I think this reveals some deep patriarchal, even misogynist tendencies that still exist in our societies, that women making their own choices, girls making their own choices, is still really difficult to embrace. And it's still really difficult to see as a kind of an act of a full agent. Men's bodies are not regulated to the same degree as women's bodies are. And so I think what it is it's a space in which vulnerable members of our society become sort of these pawns in these debates and become subject to this governmentality and become subject to these restrictions, because that's a space where you can exert control. You can try to make something out of the chaos, out of the frustration, out of the uncertainty. But this question of why women's bodies, it's always present.
Many will argue that some of these negative emotions grew just after 9/11, and how the United States handled the act of terrorism back then. But then in some cases, head covering is now being tied with Islamist political influence, which many are beginning to see like some act of defiance against the United States or against imperial states. How do countries begin, especially secular countries, begin to reconcile that image of the hijabs being tied with certain political Islamic political identity, when in any case it's just about, for many Muslim women, it's just about a religious obligation to demonstrate piety, or just to demonstrate some high moral value.
Yeah, when does an individual agent become a political actor, right? This is the question that I think this is really getting to, and there's not a simple answer. There are a lot of ways in which individual actors are just that. And I think a lot of these debates are about whether or not individual actors with agency, with sovereignty, whether they're just individuals or if they're part of a larger story, a larger collective. And in our work, we really interviewed women who identified in both ways. We interviewed women who just saw themselves as, the average Jane, the average Miriam, just trying to go about their day in a right way. And so they could sleep well at night. They could provide for their families. They could be a good wife, be a good mother, be a good employee or a good worker or a business owner, and do it all in a way that is morally upstanding. We also interviewed people and met with people who did see wearing the hijab as an anti-American statement. This has certainly been part of the discussion in France and in Turkey, for example, where American imperialism and American foreign policy has wrought such negative outcomes in these countries that certainly, political expressions of defiance are to be expected. We did also see women in the United States who saw wearing the hijab as a political expression of their rights as an individual, which occupies something sort of in between, right? They're an individual agent trying to do their thing, but they are also trying to do it in a way that says, I am part of this society. I am a taxpayer. I am a citizen, and I belong here. And the way that I belong here is in the way that I choose to, which is with the hijab. And so this idea of choice was such an important part of the way that American Muslim women identified themselves as Muslim. They chose to do it. They were not coerced. They were not forced. And as a result, then that political agency sort of stemmed from the idea that they were making these decisions on their own, and they were not a tool of or a expression of someone else's ideology.
I like the fact that you talk about choice, and we'll get into that in a second. Before we talk about the choices of these Muslim women, I'd just like you to quickly explain a very interesting line that I found in your book when you talked about the fact that the politicization of wearing scarves happen, almost exclusively in the social rather than in the institutional. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, trying to remember which line in particular you're pointing to, but I think, the general idea in America was that we found that women would wear the hijab. They would put on the headscarf as a matter of sort of personal choice. And it had these social and political outcomes. They were not institutionally political. They were socially invoked first. And what that meant is that it became part of who were part of their friend groups, their friend networks, their family networks. And then those networks could become politically active. And so you see this kind of nested identity and action, right? So you have the individual and then this sort of community that would also embrace the hijab along the same kinds of lines. And then that community would become active, for example, in the mosque. And through the mosque, they would have political activism or social or civil society activism as a result. So it wasn't often the case that one individual person was, sort of taking the helm and speaking out politically, but it was more that they saw themselves as part of a collective, part of a social group. And that social group had conduits, institutional conduits for their political voice.
Interesting. So let's talk about choice now. There's the thinking that the wearing of hijabs is some sort of an involuntary act by many Muslim women, and it symbolizes the oppression of women. Now, in your study, and over the years when you have interacted with Muslim women across the Middle East and the West, did you find that connection, or did you find that connection between wearing of hijabs as it symbolizes the oppression of women, or that it was an involuntary act by many Muslim women?
So less so in the United States. In the work in the US that we did, there's very little compulsion. There's very little push for women to wear the hijab, like from society at large, perhaps from their friend group or from their family group. But as a result, because the pressure is not pronounced in every facet of life, women identified wearing the hijab as a choice, sort of first and foremost, and in particular, a pious choice. It was one that demonstrated and led to, so it was both the outcome and the method for achieving Islamic piety. In the case of Jordan, it was more the case, not that it was involuntary, although certainly and individually that could be true, but the expectation, I think, is there for a lot of young girls. That once they begin puberty, that they will begin to wear the hijab, I think is generally the expectation. In my book on Jordan, I tell the story about a close friend of mine who, after she finished university, she took off the hijab. And as a result, she faced a lot of social ostracism. People were very unkind to her. A professor refused to speak with her. And I think that the bottom line is that, women should have the right to make their decisions, whether it's to put it on or take it off. And it's about respecting women as individuals and agents more than anything else. And these fears in society, right? That and I think like the fear of Islamic radicalism is one example, that somehow women's dress corresponds to violence, either against these women, symbolic violence, or political violence, or acts of terrorism even. I think we need to be really careful about these linkages, because first of all, it is rarely women who are enacting these large-scale sort of Islamic acts of terrorism, for starters, right? I mean, there are exceptions, of course, with ISIS in the case of Syria, but even then, it's much less so, and so just because perhaps we see a larger representation of Islam in the public sphere, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is a more austere or radical or fundamentalist religion, right? I mean, we can think of neighborhoods or places all around the world where church bells ring on Sunday mornings and the presence of Christianity is quite strong, but that happens in very secular societies, right? Like France, for example, where you might see the presence of a large number of churches and spaces of piety, of Christian piety. But France is one of the most secular nations with regard to sort of personal practice of anywhere. The United States, by contrast, is a space in which a large number of Americans self-identify as religious adherents, whether Christian or Muslim or Jewish or something else. There's a larger space to say, I am a religious person in America. And so I think we just have to say that the larger presence of religion does not mean that that type of religion is a fundamentalist one. It can be a very moderate, a very open, a very inclusive vision of religion, of any religion, and take a large space in the public sphere. Just because it is present in the public sphere does not mean that it is of a radical, exclusive, violent type.
Interesting. A lot of women that you interviewed talked about the fact that the head covering, the wearing of the scarf for them, helps them, a lot of women, desexualize social interactions and to protect women from being harassed. I mean, is that a general sentiment for women in the West, as it is a sentiment for women that you've spoken to in the Middle East? How these hijabs helps them to desexualize social interactions and to protect them from being victims of abuse from men?
Yeah, I think that's the hope on the part of most of the women. It's not always the reality. There are many anecdotes and many experiences of my friends even going on Hajj and being sexually assaulted or harassed at the Kaaba, at the most sacred site of Islam. You can go to Bethlehem and get sexually harassed or assaulted. I think the prevalence of challenges for women and their bodies in the public sphere persist. I think women try to avoid that at any cost. And for many women, that means dressing in ways that are more modest. I think, however, the issue with this is that, number one, it's not a shield. It's not a total protection. These things still happen. It's the hope, right? But the other issue is that it continues to place the onus of responsibility on women. It means that women buy into this idea that it's my responsibility to stop sexual harassment or sexual assault. So therefore, I will dress more modestly. And I think that's problematic. I think while, yes, we all hope for an end of women getting sexually harassed or assaulted, the fact is women dressing differently does not put an end to it, regardless of which kind of dress that might be. And time and again, the courts continue to show us that they are willing to side with male perpetuators who say, it's what she was wearing or what she was doing or what she was drinking or, something along those lines. And so I think the narrative needs to change ultimately to protect women.
Interesting. I also found something fascinating in your work where you talked about the fact that it seemed like for many of the Muslim converts, Muslim women converts, they saw the scarf wearing, the hijab, as something that helped them towards their journey of piety, and it's ultimately preceded, the larger faith, of Islam itself. Can you explain, that part of the study? How the hijab was seen more as an enablement or some sort of a help towards the journey of building their religious faith.
Yeah, the hijab in the study in the US especially really became both a method and an outcome of piety, right? So it's both and. So it's not as though people felt a sense of piety and therefore they put it on, which is very much more the narrative that I experienced amongst like these older women in the Middle East, for example, where they realized they needed to act in a certain way and be religious, and they sort of embraced a vision of Islam, and then they put on the headscarf, right? No. I think for the younger generations in both the Middle East and in the United States, this idea that it's both method and outcome for piety prevails. I mean, the idea is that because many view the hijab as forever, like once you put it on, you never take it off. I mean, there is some flexibility in some places. The United States has some flexibility amongst the communities. There are other parts of the Middle East where it's sort of less strict in certain ages or times in one's life where it's less strict. But the general sentiment is that once you decide to put on the hijab, you have to keep it on. And the decision then to put it on becomes such a challenging decision for many women that they view this hardship as part of developing their own personal piety. It's like fasting, for example. I mean, many people fast of all different religions. It's a hard thing to do. People do it for diets. They do it for all kinds of reasons, right? But this idea that like you offer your body as a sacrifice, as a way to cultivate a sense of your religious life, and to think about the things that are meaningful and the things that are important. Like this is the method of the hijab, is that this can be a hardship. I think I'm not an expert on the case of Nigeria, but I do imagine that there are at least some instances in which women understand that if they put this on, they may be excluded from schools. They may be excluded from certain professions. They may be excluded from certain ceremonies. But the idea that then they would put it on anyway as a way to, develop their personal piety, to develop their goodly self, becomes then the method of the hijab.
I mean, there's this question that has been, ringing in my head, which is the fact that secular countries, do have a challenge, or countries that want to identify as being secular countries. Because on the one hand, these secular countries promise rights and liberties for all of their citizens, and the rights to practice whatever religion of their choice. But then they also have a problem when especially Muslim women appear in classrooms or in public places with these hijabs, and it evokes an entirely new debate. So how do countries find this balance between trying to identify as a secular country that de-emphasizes religion in public places, and then respecting the rights of Muslim women, for instance, who choose to wear their hijab in public places and not being seen as a demonstration of a religious identity in the public spaces that is striving to be secular?
Yeah, so this is where I think my American biases emerge pretty quickly. I don't see the problem with having religious symbols in public spaces. I think that there is a beauty, in fact, to saying we are a diverse society, we are a diverse community, socially, culturally, linguistically, and religiously. And we can celebrate these ways that we're different and the ways that we're special. And I think that, America has also a constitutional separation of church and state. But that But what that, I think the ideal in practice means is not that religion becomes part of the private sphere, only something you do at home or you only do in your head. But I think what the separation of church and state means is that the state does not endorse one religious position over another. The state gives space for them to flourish. There are different models, right? So that's the kind of American model or the Canadian model as well, that says, your religion is free and you are free to practice it and you are free to live it in a way that then also enables you and your neighbors to be active citizens and full citizens equally. And there are other models, of course, for this around the world. The French have been especially stringent about wanting signs of personal piety kept out of public spaces. There are challenges, I think, to this, which is that people are whole people. They're not only, these de-religionized identities. They are active identities and whole people and full persons. If you were to ask a mother to keep any reference to their children or any mention of their children or their family out of the public sphere, that would be impossible, right? I couldn't go longer than now a half hour before mentioning my daughter. It's part of who we are. We are a whole people. We live in societies in which we want to be good people. And I think that includes embracing what that means in its totality. Whether it's religion or family or whatever these kind of moral guideposts are in our lives, to ask people to criminalize people for not allowing them to live in the ways that they believe is right and good, I think is wrong. Let people be morally good people in the ways that they can, and then set the parameters around how to do that together. That's, I think, the vision for society that can work.
Interesting. I mean, like I said, Nigeria also tries to identify as being secular, but it's interesting to note that just like the example of what happens in public secondary schools, in fact, even the Nigerian law school, a young lady who graduated as a lawyer was almost not giving, her certificate when she appeared at the ceremony wearing a hijab, and she was denied essentially that. So I guess my final question to you will be that what the acceptance of Muslim women wearing hijab in public spaces, what will it depend on? Will it continuously depend on how people view fundamental Islamism across the world? Or would we get to a point where we'd begin to see these women, for who they are, and as part of their choices to identify with the hijab, as part of their moral or religious obligation, and not necessarily, linking them with terrorism and a consequence of Islamophobia, if you ask me?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important question. And one line of both theory and political practice that has proven to work very well time and again is to embrace as a society the voices and persons who represent what we would call like a so-called moderate Islam. That actually the people who are best poised to combat Islamic fundamentalism, radicalization, terrorism, the violence that is so spectacular and grotesque and scary, really, that the best voices for the best people for countering this are the young Muslims themselves. That the tools for reaching and moderating, if you will, Islam in these societies are not to push it to the extremes or to push it to the margins or to push it out of the public sphere. No. Time and again, we see that if you push religion out of the public sphere, it comes back in harsh, strong ways. but rather to embrace the moderate voices, to embrace the people who are active in society as citizens, as equals, as educated, morally sound persons contributing to society. Who cares if they wear a headscarf or not? The fact is that they are going to help us achieve a peaceful, diverse society into the future. And, you know, to push those people out of society, out of law, out of schools, out of these ceremonies because of what they're wearing on their head does ultimately a disservice to your society at large, to all of our societies at large. Because what it means is it doesn't give the space to embrace and to say, this is an Islam that we like, that we want to keep, and these are the people who are part of our society as citizens and our peers in making this vision for our society come together.
Dr. Sarah Tobin, it's a fantastic way to end this conversation and this interview. It's been really revealing. It's been really educating, and thank you for your time. And I must again thank you for the incredible work you did with the book. It's been an asset to many of us, not just in the media, but into the intellectual space in Nigeria. So thank you very much for joining us on the program this morning.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure. I'd be welcome. I'd be happy to join you at any time.
Thank you so much. Do have a wonderful day, and my regards to your daughter.
Thank you so much.